For a long time, Cormac McCarthy's 1985 novel Blood Meridian was a total enigma to me. I first learned of the book's existence while searching for lists of what people consider to be the best books of all time, and amidst your Joyces, your Melvilles and your Pynchons, this novel in particular stood out to me for one reason. It's a Western. Prior to reading this book, my main experiences with Westerns had either been through Clint Eastwood movies, random snippets of outdated cowboys and Indian cliches in pop culture, or through the Red Dead games, one of which is, hopefully, fingers crossed, on the screen right now. I just didn't know how something located firmly in the Western genre could be considered high literature, or worthy of inclusion in the best of lists alongside non-genre fiction. This isn't because I consider Westerns to be devoid of the potential for art. Both Red Dead games are worthy arguments for video games being art, and use the medium to explore a variety of philosophical themes. I also hear good things about the movie Unforgiven, but I haven't got around to watching that yet. No, I was more surprised that the people who make these lists would consider genre fiction good enough to put up alongside Ulysses and In Search of Lost Time. From my experience, most literary-minded people tend to look down upon genre fiction, stuff like sci-fi, fantasy, horror and the like, for being riddled with cliches and overall not as serious or artistic as typical literary writing. So what is it about Blood Meridian that sets it apart from your typical pulp western novel? Well, turns out quite a bit. Before I begin discussing the novel, I should say that it's a very brutal and graphic read, so consider this your warning for the stuff I'm going to talk about. I'll try and avoid the more grisly details, the more gory details, but there will be references to themes that people will find disturbing. Later on, there will also be spoilers for the latter sections of the novel, but I'm going to mark those up closer to the point. Blood Meridian follows the life of a young runaway known only as the Kid, and later the Man, as he struggles through a directionless existence in the southwestern United States. After a series of early exploits, he joins a rogue branch of the US Army, waging their own independent war against Mexico. This endeavour ends terribly, with the Kid and others being captured and arrested by the Mexican government. Then, they are freed and recruited by a group of scalp hunters known as the Glanton Gang, led by the eponymous John Joel Glanton. This is where the main focus of the novel begins, following the gang's brutal livelihood as they hunt down indigenous Americans, butcher their villages, and take their scalps back to the Mexican government for payment. What would normally be a standard plot is given over to portrayals of horrific, often nihilistic violence as Glanton and his men carve out a living. Overseeing it all is Judge Holden, a pale monolith of a man who may be considered the central character of the entire novel. An enigmatic polymath, Holden serves as one of the most terrifying, if not the most terrifying, character in all of literature. But this novel is far from your typical blood-splattered, hyper-gruesome pulp fare. The book is truly violent and disturbing, but there's an inherent sadness about the senselessness of the violence on display. It doesn't celebrate or justify the butchery, and barely any of it can be interpreted to serve any sort of higher cause or necessity. There are no illusions here. However, the book isn't written in the kind of blunt, purely matter-of-fact way that you might expect. Blood Meridian is more morosely philosophical about violence than any piece of media I've seen, and couples passages about the indiscriminate slaughter of Apaches with paragraphs of beautiful scenic description. At the same time, McCarthy's way of writing might catch a lot of people by surprise. The most obvious example I can think of is the lack of speech marks to denote when a character is speaking, something that I remember us actually getting roasted for back in primary school, and a stylistic choice that can be confusing when you're just getting into the novel and you're learning how each of the characters speak. But the eccentricity that stuck with me especially is McCarthy's use of run-on sentences. Sentences that stretch out, often for several lines, are usually unpunctuated and connected together using a lot of ands. This may sound like I'm being too technical, but the long sentences do have a relevant effect. They end up making sections of the book read like Bible passages. Compare this passage from Leviticus. He shall be brought unto the priest, and the priest shall go forth out of the camp, and the priest shall look, and behold, if the plague of leprosy be healed in the leper. To this passage from Blood Meridian. Scribes crouched by the steps, with their quills and inkpots and bowls of sand, and lepers moaning through the streets, and naked dogs that seemed composed of bone entirely, and vendors of tamales, and old women with faces dark and harrowed. The passage from Blood Meridian is somewhat longer, but hopefully the similarities are apparent. By imitating the style of the most revered holy book in contemporary United States culture, McCarthy is drawing a dark parallel between the story he has to tell and the book often seen as a cornerstone of much of Western civilization. More importantly, however, much of civilization has usually viewed the Bible as a universal good, a positive force guiding and granting meaning to people's lives. It's a social force as well as a spiritual one, and the novel's twisting of this style to serve a more sinister purpose makes reading it incredibly haunting. While I don't think the book is meant to be interpreted entirely religiously, it still deals with, and often defiles, familiarly Christian themes. The kid, the central character for at least the first 100 pages or so, represents a sense of innocence that is steadily lost upon being exposed to Blood Meridian's brutal world. At 14, the kid runs away from his alcoholic father in Tennessee, and after several encounters in the nearby states, including a near-death experience where he is shot below the heart, makes his way to Texas. It's here that McCarthy tells us that the kid is finally divested of all that he has been. His meager origins have been wiped away, and the kid is reborn almost as a blank slate. He's kind of the reader avatar. We're going into this world fresh and having barely any idea of what's going to happen either. The kid's exposure to the horrors in Blood Meridian and his almost insatiable curiosity is what makes much of the novel so gripping. This is especially apparent when it comes to his relationship with the malevolent Judge Holden. I saw another video talk about how the kid and Holden kind of orbit each other throughout the novel, and I think that's a good way of describing it. Both are intrigued by the other, and their interactions, especially following the dissolution of the Glanton gang, lead to some of the most gripping passages in the novel. There's a scene later on where the kid and an ally are fleeing from the judge across a desert, and McCarthy doesn't even describe the judge as he's following them, but you can feel him approaching somewhere in the distance, beyond the narrative, right on the kid's heels. Very effective. However, the most interesting part of the kid's character development to me is when he's completely absent from the novel altogether. After he joins Glanton and the gang starts its blood-soaked campaign, the kid vanishes from the narrative. We get reference to other gang members and to the gang as a whole, but the main character of the novel has practically disappeared, become a footnote to the merciless violence that Glanton perpetuates. Even during the gang's massacre on an Apache camp, one of the most disturbing scenes in the novel in my opinion, we get no mention of what the kid's doing during this at all. We just have to assume he's there, sucked into the violence, this empty vessel filled with gore. However, even after everything that happens, the kid doesn't quite fall into the nihilistic depths that the rest of the gang are mired in. Their enterprise eventually leads to them killing and scalping innocents almost as a mundane part of their lives, something they do even with no hope of financial gain behind it. The kid, on the other hand, shows mercy on multiple occasions, refusing to kill an injured member of the gang on Glanton's orders, and helping another member remove the arrow lodged in his thigh. Sometimes the kid serves to give us hope that this awful world isn't quite as irredeemable as it seems. However, that doesn't last very long. This proclivity towards mercy draws the attention of Judge Holden, the novel's most memorable and obscene character. Like Glanton and his gang, the judge was also based on a real person, and his biography must really have left a sinister mark on McCarthy because the character in Blood Meridian is an absolute monster. And it's easy to see why. Biographical information on Holden speaks of a 6'6" man with hog-like eyes who was rumoured to have committed atrocities in the Texas region. The most common story I see pop up about him involves the murder of a 10-year-old girl, with the giant hand mark on her throat painting Holden as the culprit. However, he was also well read, and called the best educated man in northern Mexico. These traits carry over into Blood Meridian, with Holden being a supremely, almost otherworldly, well-educated man, able to converse fluently with Mexican soldiers and lecture at length on topics like philosophy and archaeology. This only makes it all the more insidious when Holden's diatribes become exhalations about the glory of war and conquest, and dead children start showing up suspiciously close to Holden's last location. The man personifies the message lying at Blood Meridian's core, that war is an inevitable and intrinsic part of the human experience. As I read more of the novel, I stopped seeing him as a human entirely. The novel then started to play on my perceptions, especially during one of the kid's dream sequences, where he eventually concludes that Holden, bizarrely, has no conceivable ancestry or place of origin. I've seen a lot of talk revolving around what Holden is exactly, whether he's a djinn or a demon or something like that, but I feel like this very literal attempt to pin him down is not only doomed to failure, but also takes a lot of the impact out of the novel. All we need to understand is that Judge Holden represents an articulate, destructive force that has existed since the start of humanity. This force is encapsulated no stronger than at the novel's close. And obviously we're getting into spoilers for this bit. The kid manages to escape the Glanton Gang's massacre at the hands of the Yuma people, and survives a series of encounters with Holden before living a 30-year stint essentially as a drifter. Finally, after decades of no contact, he meets the judge one last time at a bar, in which the two have a final, tense conversation. Finally, in one of the novel's most famous scenes, they bump into each other in an outhouse, in which the judge gathers the kid in his arms against his immense and terrible flesh. This scene, in which the kid seemingly dies or is violated in some unspeakable eldritch manner, completely breaks from the blunt and graphic descriptions of violence seen throughout the rest of the novel. We aren't even told what the two men that discover his body are so repulsed by. We don't even know that they see a body or anything recognizable at all. The judge has simply eradicated the kid's character from the narrative altogether, erasing the last bit of innocence that seemed to contradict his violent worldview. With the kid gone, only the judge remains, and with that, the novel starts to collapse. With any reason and rationality having been erased, the final paragraphs focus on a frenzied dance within the saloon, the narrative switching from past to present as the judge towers over them all, repeatedly proclaiming that he will never sleep and never die. The judge in this end scene has passed the point of ever being perceptible as a real-life figure, or even as a human in the context of the novel itself. He is the ever-present form of evil that stalks the human race, that is somehow the cause and consequence of civilization's tendency towards warfare, and as he proclaims again that he will never die, the novel stops, annihilated in a dance of death. However, although Holden is there at the end of Blood Meridian's main narrative, there is a half-page epilogue to close out the book, which feels almost apocalyptic, considering the judge's seizure and destruction of the narrative only a page before. The epilogue follows a nameless man drilling a series of regimented holes across the desert with some sort of automated device. With every hole drilled, he strikes fire in the hole and draws out his steel. Then they all move on again. They referring to himself and also a group of nomadic bone collectors that follow him. This repetitive procedure seems like an enigmatic way to end the novel at first, but it's one final statement on the endless causality of the human experience. With steel, we punch holes in our fellow man. Then with the tiresome, monotonous burden of a physical labor, we take the steel out and we punch again. Over and over and over until the end of time. Even a monster like Judge Holden, as large and enigmatic and terrible as he is but a ripple in a far greater sea of blood. I finished reading Blood Meridian at about 2 AM, and I was so shaken but weirdly exhilarated by its ending that I got straight out of bed, straight onto the PC, and I started reading any commentary on the book that I could find. It was so blunt yet mysterious, so beautiful yet obviously brutal, that I had to try and sate my curiosity about it somehow. Hence, well, this long and kind of rambly video, I suppose. I don't think I've even fully figured the book out yet, and there's loads that I haven't even begun to touch on, but hopefully I've inspired you to check it out for yourselves, give it a read. And I also hope that you have enjoyed this video. See you sooner for the next one. Maybe. What is a consistent schedule, anyway?